Olaudah Equiano describes the Middle Passage, 1789. He describes the terror of the transatlantic slave trade. Equiano eventually purchased his freedom and lived in London, where he advocated for abolition. At last, when the ship we were in had got in all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put under deck, so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air, but now that the whole ship's cargo was confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place, the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves, of which many died, thus falling victims to the improvident avarice, as I may call it, of their purchasers. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Happily, perhaps, for myself, I was soon reduced so low here that it was thought necessary to keep me almost always on deck, and from my extreme youth I was not put in fetters. In this situation I expected every hour to share the fate of my companions, some of whom were almost daily brought upon deck at the point of death, which I began to hope would soon put an end to my miseries. Often did I think many of the inhabitants of the deep much more happy than myself. I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wished I could change my condition for theirs. Every circumstance I met with served only to render my state more painful and heighten my apprehensions in my opinion of the cruelty of the whites. One day they had taken a number of fishes, and when they had killed and satisfied themselves with as many as they thought fit, to our astonishment who were on the deck, rather than give any of them to us to eat, as we expected, they tossed the remaining fish into the sea again, although we begged and prayed for some as well we could, but in vain. And in some of my countrymen, being pressed by hunger, took an opportunity, when they thought no one saw them, of trying to get a little privately, but they were discovered, and the attempt procured them some very severe floggings. One day when we had a smooth sea and a moderate wind, two of my wearied countrymen who were chained together, I was near them at the time, preferring death to such a life of misery, somehow made through the nettings and jumped into the sea. Immediately another quite dejected fellow, who on account of his illness was suffered to be out of irons, also followed their example, and I believe many more would have soon done the same if they had not been prevented by the ship's crew, who were instantly alarmed. Those of us that were the most active were, in a moment, put down under the deck, and there was such a noise and confusion amongst the people of the ship as I had never heard before, to stop her and get the boat to go out after the slaves. However, two of the wretches were drowned, but they got the other and afterward flogged him unmercifully for thus attempting to prefer death to slavery. In this matter, we continue to undergo more hardships than I can now relate, hardships which are inseparable from this accursed trade. Many a time we were near suffocation from the want of fresh air, which we were often without for whole days together. This and the stench of the necessary tubs carried off many. During our passage, I first saw flying fishes, which surprised me very much. They used frequently to fly across the ship, and many of them fell on the deck. Also now first saw the use of the quadrant. I had often, with astonishment, seen the mariners make observations with it, and I could not think what it meant. They at last took notice of my surprise, and one of them, willing to increase it as well as to gratify my curiosity, made me one day look through it. The clouds appeared to me to be land, which disappeared as they passed along. This heightened my wonder, and I was now more persuaded than ever that I was in another world, and that everything about me was magic. At last we came in sight of the island of Barbados, at which the whites on board gave a great shout, and made many signs of joy to us. world history. So I had you read Olaudah Equiano's excerpt on this middle passage voyage from his very well-known autobiography. And it's very interesting, I would say. Just a little backstory on Equiano. So he and his sister were out playing, and some people came and kidnapped them. And this excerpt that we read of his autobiography is the story or the truth of how that took place and what it was like. So in this particular excerpt of his autobiography, we're talking about his travels from his homeland to America. And so one thing that he talks about is the stench. And so stench is the same way as saying the smell of something. And so unfortunately, what would happen on these slave ships is that there wouldn't be a way for the slaves to go use the restroom. And they were already chained together and forced to lay down below deck of a ship. And so when you can't go to the restroom, you have to go just wherever you are. It was very hot, so people were sweating, and they're sweating on each other. And so that was not helping. Women who have certain things that happen, I mean, all of it happens right there on that ship, right next to the person beside you. And they even had quote unquote tubs for them to wash in. And the fear was that sometimes the kids would fall into these tubs and almost drown. And so Equiano very eloquently details these things that happen. And he describes the stench as being so horrible that you could almost suffocate just from the smell of everything around, because they weren't able to just go up and get fresh air. So not being able to have fresh air could almost make you just pass out from the smell of everything that was taking place there. One other thing he details is he says this phrase, inhabitants of the deep. And what that means is that he's talking about people who have died and passed on. And so he's using this terminology to say those who have gone into the deep, those who have gone into the deep water, those who are dead. And even in this excerpt, he says that he got to a place in his life where he envied them. Why did he envy them? Because they had freedom, which was something that he no longer had, and he was witnessing the ugly side of what human nature can do to people. He also accounts the fact that there was a time when the fishermen or the sailors had caught all this fish, and after they ate it all up for themselves, they threw the extra fish that they had back into the sea instead of giving it to the slaves so that they could have at least a semi-decent meal. And then he talks about being chained to another person, and how a lot of times the slaves were chained together, and how three slaves actually decided that they were going to jump off of the ship and just risk it. And how two of them ended up dying, and the sailors were able to retrieve the other slave. And he says that once they were able to retrieve the other slave, they beat him almost mercilessly. They flogged him. We talked about Jesus Christ, and I'm not comparing these things to Jesus Christ, but we talk about flogging, so we know what flogging is. And he said that flogging and whipping these slaves are things that took place on this ship. And that even though there were nets that were put down at the bottoms of the ships to keep slaves from jumping over, that some were able to get through. And so the two that drowned were able to get through, even if it was to freedom and death. And for those slaves that sometimes weren't retrieved, the slaves on board were beaten because of the other slaves' rebellion. That is the life that he was living, that he was forced to live, and many others. And so I know this was a tough excerpt to read. I know it's hard to think. I know it's hard to read. Equiano was actually very, very intelligent and eloquent as he goes on, becomes a slave, buys his freedom, and is educated. So if you read it, you can't help but respect the word usage and the intelligence behind what he's written. But it also is very hard. And a lot of people say that maybe it's not true. Maybe some of his account wasn't true because there are issues with the birth dates or years and stuff like that. But I think we all can believe that these things happen to someone at some point in our history, and it's not good. But we thank Equiano for sharing these details, sharing what is considered the first work, the first detailed work on slavery in the Middle Passage. And let's just use this as a reminder that it doesn't matter what people look like. It doesn't matter even what they think like, what they believe. We still have to treat them with the love of Jesus Christ. This was a very important excerpt. This was a very important subject for us to discuss. And I thank you for taking your time to do it. I miss you guys so much. And I just look forward to seeing you again. It's just been so long. And I just miss you so much. So please continue to work hard. And until we meet again, see you in the meantime. Bye.